welcome back to another slow and slightly confusing chapter of history. Tonight you're standing in the crisp September air of 1941, admiring the elegant spires and grand palaces of Leningrad, formerly the crown jewel of Russian culture. The Hermitage gleams in the distance, and the river sparkles beneath ornate bridges, and you're probably thinking this looks like a lovely place to visit. Well, here's your reality check in about 48 hours. You'll be trapped in what becomes the most brutal siege in human history, and honestly, you probably won't survive it. Picture this. You're a regular citizen going about your daily routine when suddenly 3 million German troops come knocking at your door with tanks, planes, and a charming plan to starve your entire city to death. Hitler himself declared he has no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. Such a sweetheart, that one. By the time you realize what's happening, escape routes have vanished faster than ice cream at a summer camp. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little community spread across different time zones, all united in our fascination with history's darker moments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up on September 8th, 1941, to the sound of explosions. Not the gentle rumble of distant thunder, but the sharp crack of artillery shells landing uncomfortably close to your apartment building. Through your window, you watch German planes circling overhead like vultures, and you're starting to realize that your pleasant European city has just become ground zero for a nightmare that will stretch on for nearly 900 days. The siege officially begins when German forces capture the fortress town of Schlüsselburg, completing their iron ring around Leningrad. You're now one of 2.5 million people trapped inside what's essentially become the world's largest prison camp. The Baltic Sea blocks you to the West Lake Ladoga, stretches endlessly to the east, and German artillery positions surround you on 3 sides like a deadly horseshoe. Within the first week, you notice the bread lines growing longer. The cheerful shopkeepers who used to chat about the weather now speak in hushed, worried tones about rationing. Historians still argue whether the German High Command initially planned such a prolonged siege or simply stumbled into this strategy when direct assault proved too costly, but the result remains the same. You're trapped with rapidly dwindling food supplies in a city designed to feed its population from outside sources. Your first clue that this isn't temporary comes when authorities announce new food rations. Workers get 600 grams of bread daily, about 1 1/3 pounds. Sounds reasonable until you realize this isn't fluffy Wonder Bread we're talking about. This is heavy dense, often mixed with sawdust and cellulose to stretch the flour supplies. Children and elderly folks get even less, while office workers like yourself receive a measly 400 grams. The psychological shift happens gradually, then all at once. You start hoarding that small piece of soap you'd normally use carelessly. You find yourself eyeing your neighbor's cat with thoughts you'd never entertained before. The elegant restaurants that once served borscht and caviar now post signs reading closed until further notice, though you suspect further notice might never come. Here's a quirky detail most people don't know. Leningrad's zoo became an unexpected symbol of both tragedy and resilience. You watch keepers desperately trying to feed elephants and tigers while humans starve, creating surreal scenes of caretakers sharing their own meager rations with Bengal tigers who probably eat better than most citizens. By October, you're burning furniture to stay warm because coal shipments stopped arriving weeks ago. Your beautiful city, once compared to Venice for its canals and architectural splendor, now resembles something from a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Windows are boarded up with whatever materials people can find. Elegant courtyards fill with garbage because sanitation services have collapsed, and the constant sound of artillery creates a baseline anxiety that never quite leaves your chest. The mainstream historical consensus holds that Hitler's decision to besiege rather than storm Leningrad stemmed from his reluctance to lose troops in brutal urban warfare. German generals had witnessed the carnage of World War I's city battles and preferred the cleaner option of simply waiting for starvation to do their work for them. You quickly learn that survival requires abandoning social niceties you've followed your entire life, that elderly woman who falls in the breadline. You step over her rather than help because losing your place means your family doesn't eat today. The moral calculus of siege life doesn't allow for traditional courtesy when every calorie might mean the difference between life and death. As November approaches and temperatures drop, you realize this frozen hell has only just begun. The mathematics of starvation become your new religion, and you're terrible at this particular form of arithmetic. By November 1941, your daily bread ration has dropped to 250 grams for workers, about half a pound of what charitably gets called bread, but resembles cardboard mixed with sawdust and hope. Non-workers like children and elderly receive even less, a pathetic 125 grams, roughly the weight of a smartphone, expected to sustain human life for 24 hours. You develop the siege survivor's obsession with precise measurements. Every crumb matters now, so you find yourself counting individual pieces that fall from your daily allocation, carefully sweeping them into your palm like precious diamonds. Your kitchen scale, once used for baking elaborate cakes, becomes the most important object in your apartment. You weigh everything, obsessively dividing that meager portion into smaller meals throughout the day, because eating it all at once leaves you with the crushing psychological weight of knowing you have nothing left until tomorrow. The bread itself evolves into something barely recognizable. What started as actual wheat flour gradually transforms into a grayish substance containing cotton cake, pine bark, and whatever cellulose factory workers can grind into powder. You chew slowly, not from manners but necessity. Your weakened jaw muscles struggle with the tough, fibrous texture. Some days the bread tastes faintly of glue because that's literally what's holding it together. Here's where the cruel mathematics really hit nutritional scientists. Calculate that your daily ration provides roughly 400 to 500 calories. For context, a sedentary adult needs about 1,800 calories daily just to maintain basic bodily functions. You're operating on less than a quarter of what your body requires, which means you're essentially starving in slow motion while remaining conscious enough to experience every agonizing moment. Your body begins the predictable shutdown sequence that comes with prolonged malnutrition. First, you lose the padding around your face, giving you that hollow-cheeked, skeletal appearance that becomes tragically common throughout the city. Your hair starts falling out in disturbing clumps, and your fingernails become brittle and discolored. The most unsettling change is mental. Your thoughts become sluggish and disconnected, as if your brain is running on a dying battery. Historians still argue whether Soviet authorities fully grasped the impossibility of sustaining the population on such meager rations, or if they simply had no alternatives given the complete blockade of supply routes. The official party line insisted that everyone shared equally in the hardship, though you'll soon discover this claim stretches truth thinner than your daily bread portion. You start noticing neighbors disappearing without explanation. Mrs. Petrov from the third floor hasn't been seen in a week, and when someone finally checks her apartment, they find her body in bed, peacefully arranged, as if she simply decided to sleep forever. This becomes disturbingly routine people dying quietly in their homes, sometimes undiscovered for days, because everyone assumes they're just too weak to venture outside. The psychology of hunger creates its own peculiar madness. You find yourself having elaborate fantasies about pre-war meals, remembering the taste of butter with hallucinogenic intensity. Some people carry photographs of food cut from old magazines, staring at pictures of roast chicken and chocolate cake like religious icons. Others develop the opposite reaction, becoming nauseated by any mention of abundant meals because the contrast with reality feels too painful to bear. Your apartment building develops its own microeconomy of desperation. People trade family heirlooms for single cigarettes, which themselves become currency more valuable than rubles. A gold wedding ring might buy you an extra day's bread ration, assuming you can find someone willing to trade food for jewelry. Money becomes meaningless when there's nothing to purchase. What good are savings when every store stands empty? Here's a quirky detail that reveals the siege's surreal nature. Leningrad's public library remained open throughout much of the blockade, and people continued checking out books even while starving. Librarians reported increased demand for cookbooks, which served as a form of psychological escape, allowing readers to mentally prepare elaborate feasts they'd never taste. The most heartbreaking aspect of your mathematical desperation involves watching families make impossible choices about resource allocation. Parents secretly give portions of their own rations to children hastening their own deaths while buying their kids perhaps a few extra weeks. You witness mothers growing skeletal while trying to maintain some semblance of normal feeding schedules for toddlers who don't understand why mama looks like a walking ghost. Your sleep becomes fitful and strange, filled with dreams about food that feel more vivid than waking life. You wake up convinced you've just eaten a full meal, only to have reality crash down as your empty stomach reminds you that it was just another cruel trick of your malnourished brain. Some survivors report that these food dreams became so realistic they provided temporary psychological relief, like a brief vacation from the constant gnawing hunger. The social fabric begins unraveling in predictable ways. People become suspicious and paranoid about others receiving larger rations or hiding food supplies. Friendships dissolve over accusations of hoarding, and families split apart when members suspect each other of stealing from the communal food stores. You learn to eat your rations in secret because the sight of someone else consuming food becomes almost unbearable when you're perpetually starving. As winter deepens and your body continues its slow motion collapse, You realize that surviving on mathematical crumbs requires abandoning your humanity piece by piece. Lake Ladoga stretches before you like a frozen death trap, masquerading as salvation, and you're about to bet your life on 30 kilometers of questionable ice. Remember those bread ration calculations that barely kept you breathing? Well, here's the cosmic joke. The only thing standing between your city and complete starvation is this massive lake that freezes just thick enough to maybe support truck traffic, assuming you don't mind the occasional plunge into water cold enough to kill you in minutes. You're part of the convoy system that locals call the Road of Life, though Road of Maybe Not Dying Today seems more accurate. Soviet engineers spent weeks testing ice thickness with primitive tools, basically poking the frozen surface with sticks and hoping for the best. The official minimum thickness for truck traffic is 7 inches, but you're discovering that ice doesn't always cooperate with official requirements, especially when German artillery keeps blasting holes in your frozen highway. The journey begins at Kobona, on the eastern shore, where you load trucks with desperately needed supplies while trying not to think about the fact that Lake Ladoga spans over 17,000 square kilometers of water that really doesn't want to stay frozen. Your truck carries flour ammunition and medical supplies, everything Leningrad needs to survive another day. The irony isn't lost on you that these same supplies might become your tomb decorations if the ice decides to give way. You quickly learn the bizarre physics of ice road travel. Drive too fast, and your truck creates something called resonance oscillations. Basically, your vehicle's vibrations cause the ice to crack and flex like a frozen trampoline. The speed limit is strictly enforced at 25 kilometers per hour, not because of traffic laws, but because anything faster might send you into a watery grave. Historians still argue whether more trucks were lost to German bombing or simply to drivers who got impatient and pushed their luck with unstable ice. The convoy spacing follows its own deadly logic. Maintain exactly 50 meters between vehicles to prevent multiple trucks from hitting weak spots simultaneously. You watch the truck ahead of you using its taillights as navigation beacons through the swirling snow and darkness. Lose sight of those lights, and you're essentially flying blind across a frozen lake in the middle of a war zone while German pilots actively try to kill you. Here's a quirky detail that perfectly captures the surreal nature of ice road logistics. Soviet engineers built an entire infrastructure on the frozen lake, complete with road signs, traffic control points, and even repair workshops. You pass temporary bridges, spanning cracks in the ice maintenance stations, where mechanics work on trucks in sub-zero temperatures, and medical aid posts staffed by doctors who specialize in treating frostbite and hypothermia. The White Angels guide your convoy like frozen ghosts with flashlights. These brave women stand at crucial points along the route, directing traffic with hand signals and light patterns that help drivers navigate the constantly shifting ice conditions. You watch them through your windshield, bundled in heavy coats, stamping their feet to maintain circulation while guiding truck after truck toward what they hope is solid ice. Many of these angels die when German bombs shatter the ice beneath their feet, but new volunteers always step forward to replace them. Your truck's engine sounds different in the extreme cold, rougher, more strained, like it's fighting every revolution of the crankshaft. The fuel lines threaten to freeze despite additives, and your breath creates ice crystals on the windshield that you constantly scrape away with numb fingers. The steering wheel becomes so cold it burns your hands through thick gloves, and you develop the peculiar skill of driving while maintaining minimal contact with metal surfaces. The German Luftwaffe treats your convoy like a shooting gallery, diving out of the gray sky to strafe the ice with machine gun fire and drop bombs that create spectacular fountains of water and ice shards. You learn to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft, that distinctive engine whine that means you have about 30 seconds to abandon your truck and lie flat on the ice, hoping that a thin layer of frozen water provides adequate protection from explosive shells. When trucks break through the ice, the rescue protocol is grimly efficient. You have minutes, not hours, to extract the driver before hypothermia sets in. The water temperature hovers around freezing, which sounds manageable until you realize that around freezing still kills you faster than you can swim to safety. Rescue teams use ropes and hooks to pull both trucks and drivers from the lake, though they save more drivers than vehicles. The mainstream historical consensus holds that the Road of Life saved Leningrad by delivering roughly 1.6 million tons of supplies over 2 winter seasons. But you're living through the less celebrated reality. Every single ton came at the cost of tremendous human suffering and constant mortal danger. Your most terrifying moments come during blizzards, when visibility drops to zero and you navigate purely by instinct and the faint impression of tire tracks in the snow ahead. The ice groans and cracks beneath your truck's weight, creating sounds like distant thunder or approaching doom. You learn to distinguish between normal ice settlement and the sharp crack that means you need to accelerate immediately or risk plunging through weak spots. As dawn breaks over the frozen lake, you realize you've survived another crossing, though tomorrow you'll have to do it all again. Beneath your feet lies a hidden Leningrad that most of the starving population never suspects exists, a labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and secret archives that transforms the siege into something resembling a subterranean chess match. While you're upstairs calculating breadcrumbs and dodging artillery shells, an entire shadow city operates in basements, sewers, and purpose-built shelters that house everything from priceless artworks to classified military communications. You descend into the Hermitage's basement levels, where museum curators have created the world's most surreal underground storage facility. Paintings by Rembrandt and Picasso hang next to emergency medical supplies, while sculptures that normally grace elegant galleries now share space with ammunition crates and radio equipment. The irony strikes you immediately. These masterpieces created to celebrate human achievement now huddle in darkness while the city above demonstrates humanity's capacity for systematic destruction. The museum staff developed elaborate protocols for protecting cultural treasures that read like something from a spy novel. You watch curators wrapping paintings in waterproof materials, carefully cataloging each piece before moving it to deeper, more secure storage areas. Some artworks were evacuated by train before the siege tightened, but thousands remained behind, creating an underground treasure trove that German forces never suspected existed just beneath their bombing targets. Here's where things get genuinely bizarre. The Hermitage basement became an unlikely community center where intellectuals, artists, and museum workers created a parallel society focused on preserving culture rather than merely surviving. You attend poetry readings by candlelight, surrounded by Renaissance masterpieces and cases of military rations. Historians still argue whether this cultural preservation effort represented admirable dedication to human achievement or misguided priorities during a humanitarian catastrophe, but you're witnessing something unprecedented, civilization refusing to surrender even when surrounded by barbarism. The sewer system transforms into Leningrad's secret highway network, allowing essential personnel to move around the city without exposing themselves to constant artillery bombardment. You crawl through tunnels that smell like a mixture of human waste and death, following guides who've memorized every turn and junction in the underground maze. These tunnel rats, as they call themselves, include everyone from military messengers to black market food dealers who use the sewers to transport goods without detection. Your most unsettling discovery involves the city's morgue overflow system. With traditional burial impossible due to frozen ground and constant bombardment, authorities converted subway construction sites and basement areas into temporary body storage facilities. You pass rooms filled with corpses, stacked like cordwood, preserved by the bitter cold, waiting for spring thaw when proper burials might become possible. The smell never leaves your nostrils, a sweet, cloying odor of death that permeates your clothing and follows you back to the surface. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the siege's strange priorities. Soviet authorities maintained detailed archives throughout the blockade, creating meticulous records of everything from daily bread production to casualty reports. You discover clerks working by lamplight in basement offices, carefully documenting the city's slow-motion collapse with bureaucratic precision that would be admirable if it weren't so eerily detached from the suffering occurring directly overhead. The underground communication network becomes increasingly sophisticated as the siege progresses. You learn about hidden radio stations operating from basement locations, broadcasting coded messages to partisan groups operating behind German lines. These radio operators risk immediate execution if discovered, but they maintain contact with the outside world, while official communication channels remain jammed or destroyed by enemy action. Some of the most crucial underground facilities house the city's remaining medical supplies and makeshift hospitals. You visit basement clinics where doctors perform surgery by candlelight, using instruments sterilized with alcohol that's more valuable than gold. These underground medical facilities treat everything from malnutrition to bomb injuries, though supplies remain so limited that doctors often choose which patients receive treatment based on likelihood of survival rather than medical need. The heating systems in these underground spaces create their own microclimate of survival. While surface temperatures plummet to deadly levels, basement areas maintain slightly warmer conditions due to residual heat from building foundations and the body warmth of people crowded together. You witness families essentially moving underground for the winter, creating improvised living spaces in building basements where they huddle together for warmth and protection. Your most shocking discovery involves the secret food storage facilities that certain well-connected individuals maintain in hidden basement locations. While ordinary citizens starve on 125-gram bread rations, you stumble across underground caches containing canned goods, preserved meats, and luxury items that disappeared from public distribution weeks ago. These hidden stockpiles represent a parallel economy where political connections matter more than official ration cards. The psychological impact of underground life creates its own form of siege madness. You spend days at a time in basement shelters, losing track of whether it's day or night above ground. The constant artificial lighting and recycled air create a dreamlike state where time becomes fluid and reality feels negotiable. Some people adapt to underground living so completely they become reluctant to return to the surface, even when bombardment decreases. As you navigate this subterranean world, you realize that survival often depends less on what you know than on what you discover in the hidden spaces beneath your feet. Welcome to the greatest hypocrisy show on earth, where Communist Party officials preach equality while dining on caviar and champagne in heated dachas just kilometers from where you're eating wallpaper paste and contemplating whether your leather shoes qualify as dinner. The siege reveals the ugly truth about Soviet classless society. Turns out some comrades are considerably more equal than others, especially when starvation becomes the great social leveler that nobody in power wants to experience personally. You discover this bitter reality when you're assigned to work detail at a party facility, expecting to find officials sharing the same grim rations that keep you perpetually on the edge of death. Instead, you walk into what can only be described as a parallel universe where well-fed bureaucrats complain about the quality of imported wine, while you've forgotten what wine even tastes like. Their faces show the healthy flush of adequate nutrition. Their bodies retain the soft curves of people who've never missed a meal, and their conversations revolve around vacation plans for after the war, rather than whether they'll survive until next Tuesday. The rationing system operates on a caste structure that would make medieval feudalism blush with embarrassment. Party officials receive Category A rations up to 800 grams of actual bread daily, plus access to meat, dairy products, and vegetables that vanished from public distribution months ago. Factory workers get Category B rations, which at least contain recognizable food products, while you and other non-essential citizens survive on Category C, that delightful mixture of sawdust cellulose and false hope that barely qualifies as edible matter. Here's where the propaganda machine reaches peak absurdity, while you're literally dying of starvation. Official radio broadcasts encourage citizens to share in the glorious sacrifice for the motherland and demonstrate revolutionary solidarity through shared hardship. You listen to these announcements while watching party officials' children playing in heated courtyards, their cheeks pink with health, completely insulated from the revolutionary solidarity being imposed on everyone else. The mainstream historical consensus acknowledges that Soviet leadership maintained separate supply chains for essential personnel, justified by the need to keep government and military functions operational during the siege. What the official accounts tend to minimize is the extent to which this system created a parallel society where political connections determined life or death more directly than even German artillery. You witness the elaborate theater of official inspections, where party leaders tour typical siege facilities that have been carefully staged to demonstrate shared sacrifice. The officials arrive in heated vehicles, spend 20 minutes examining pre-selected areas where everything has been sanitized and organized to hide the worst suffering, then return to their comfortable quarters to file reports about the population's admirable resilience. Meanwhile, the real conditions, the corpses stacked in unheated buildings, the children dying quietly in their beds, the adults reduced to skeletal shadows, remain carefully concealed from official eyes. Historians still argue whether Stalin and other top Soviet leadership fully understood the extent of suffering in Leningrad, or whether the reporting system filtered out information that contradicted official narratives about successful resistance. From your perspective, as someone living through it, this debate seems academic. Whether they knew or chose not to know, the result was identical systematic abandonment of ordinary citizens while protecting political elites. The black market economy reveals another layer of privilege-based survival. You learn about exclusive stores that technically don't exist, where party members use special currency to purchase goods that disappeared from regular shops months ago. These shadow establishments operate with the same bureaucratic efficiency as official government offices, complete with waiting lists, special appointments, and discreet delivery services that ensure important people never experience actual deprivation. Here's a quirky detail that perfectly illustrates the system's grotesque contradictions. Party officials maintained elaborate protocol requirements for formal dinners throughout the siege, complete with proper table settings, multiple courses, and wine pairings. You discover detailed menus from official banquets held while ordinary citizens were eating their own shoes, featuring dishes that required ingredients literally impossible to obtain through normal channels. The propaganda apparatus works overtime to maintain the fiction of shared sacrifice. You're required to attend morale-building meetings where officials explain how everyone is contributing equally to the war effort, while these same officials clearly haven't missed any meals and their uniforms still fit properly. The cognitive dissonance becomes almost unbearable listening to speeches about revolutionary solidarity while staring at speakers who obviously have access to adequate heating, nutrition, and medical care. Your most disturbing realization involves the medical system's hidden hierarchy. While ordinary citizens die from easily treatable conditions because medical supplies remain unavailable, party officials receive comprehensive health care from doctors who somehow maintain access to medications, proper surgical equipment, and heated facilities. The same hospitals that turn away starving civilians for lack of resources mysteriously find room and supplies when important political figures require treatment. The children of party officials attend special schools that maintain normal educational schedules, heated classrooms, and even school lunch programs while regular schools close due to lack of fuel and dead teachers. You watch these privileged children walking to class in proper winter clothing, while other kids huddle in unheated apartments, too weak from malnutrition to venture outside. As you navigate this landscape of institutionalized inequality, you realize that surviving the siege requires not just enduring German bombardment and starvation, but also swallowing the daily humiliation of watching your supposed leaders feast while you slowly waste away. The final moral calculus of siege life strips away every civilized pretense you've ever maintained, leaving you face to face with questions that shouldn't exist in the human experience. Is it murder if you steal bread from a dying child to feed your own? What about when your neighbor hasn't been seen for days and you know their apartment might contain hidden food supplies? These aren't philosophical thought experiments anymore. They're Tuesday afternoon decisions that determine who lives and who becomes another frozen corpse waiting for spring burial. You witness the gradual erosion of human taboos as starvation rewrites the fundamental rules of social interaction. The first boundary to crumble involves property rights. People begin borrowing from abandoned apartments, initially taking only essentials like fuel and blankets, but gradually progressing to systematic looting of anything remotely edible. You find yourself justifying the theft of wallpaper because its paste contains trace nutrients, telling yourself that empty apartments belong to dead people who no longer need possessions anyway. The cannibalism begins as whispered rumors that everyone desperately wants to dismiss as enemy propaganda or wartime hysteria. Then you start noticing the unusually fresh-looking meat being traded in dark alleyways and the way certain families maintain their strength while their neighbors waste away at predictable rates. The official records discovered decades later document approximately 1,500 arrests for cannibalism during the siege, though the actual numbers likely reached much higher since most cases went unreported or undetected. Here's where the moral landscape becomes genuinely terrifying. You're forced to develop internal guidelines for distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable forms of cannibalism, as if such distinctions could possibly make sense. Eating people who died from natural causes, starvation, cold disease, gradually becomes psychologically tolerable, while actively murdering someone for food remains beyond most people's moral boundaries. Yet even this line blurs when you're watching your own children slowly dying and a stranger's child might provide enough nutrition to save your family. You discover that survival often requires becoming complicit in a community conspiracy of silence about things everyone knows but nobody acknowledges directly. That mysterious meat soup your neighbor shares occasionally. Nobody asks about its ingredients. The family down the hall whose members keep disappearing one by one while the remaining relatives somehow maintain their weight. Nobody investigates too closely. These unspoken agreements allow the community to maintain some semblance of social structure while accommodating moral compromises that would have been unthinkable before the siege. The most heartbreaking moral dilemmas involve children who don't understand the new rules of survival. You watch parents struggle with impossible decisions. Do you lie to your 5-year-old about what's in tonight's soup, or do you prepare them for a reality that might destroy their innocence permanently? How do you explain why they can't play with the neighbor children who seem healthier and better fed without revealing the ugly truth about social hierarchies and resource hoarding? Historians still argue whether the extreme moral compromises made during the siege represented temporary aberrations caused by desperate circumstances, or whether they revealed fundamental truths about human nature when civilization's protective structures collapse. From your perspective, living through each moral degradation in real time, this academic debate feels irrelevant. You're too busy making daily choices between survival and humanity to worry about their philosophical implications. Here's a quirky detail that reveals both the depths of desperation and the persistence of human dignity. Some families maintained elaborate pretenses around their survival strategies, carefully preparing and serving human flesh as if it were conventional meat, complete with proper table settings and mealtime prayers. These rituals allowed people to preserve some psychological distance from actions that might otherwise drive them completely insane. The hero monster distinction becomes impossibly blurred when you witness acts of simultaneous selflessness and horror. You know a woman who saved 3 neighborhood children by sharing her own food rations, slowly starving herself to keep them alive, while also knowing that she obtained extra food by trading away her elderly mother's winter coat, essentially condemning the old woman to freeze to death. Which aspect of her behavior defines her moral character? Your most disturbing realization involves discovering your own capacity for moral compromise. You find yourself calculating the survival value of helping others, weighing acts of kindness against their cost and personal resources. That impulse to share your bread with the starving child next door gets filtered through cold mathematical assessment, while helping them improve your own survival chances through social reciprocity or simply drain resources you might need tomorrow. The social fabric adapts to accommodate moral flexibility that would have been inconceivable in peacetime. Communities develop informal hierarchies based on survival skills rather than traditional social markers. The person who knows how to find edible plants in frozen ground becomes more valuable than the former university professor, while someone willing to scavenge in dangerous areas gains respect regardless of their methods. Yet even in this moral wasteland, you witness extraordinary acts of pure human goodness that defy all logical survival calculations. Remember that stranger who gave young Sasha bread despite being close to death himself, or Yevgenia's mother sharing their family's rations with a neighbor. These moments of irrational compassion prove that humanity persists even when civilization collapses completely. As the siege finally lifts and you survey the moral landscape you've navigated, you realize that survival required becoming someone you never intended to be, while somehow retaining enough of your original self to remember who you used to be. The distant rumble of artillery fades into memory, now replaced by the gentle sounds of a world at peace. Spring arrives in Leningrad with unprecedented beauty. Every green shoot pushing through the debris feels like a small miracle. Every bird returning to the city squares seems to carry messages of hope from a universe that briefly forgot how to be kind. You've survived something that most human beings never face, and you carry those experiences forward, not as burdens, but as hard-won wisdom about what really matters when everything else falls away. The siege taught you that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about retaining enough humanity to recognize yourself when the crisis passes. In the years that follow, you'll find yourself treasuring simple pleasures with an intensity that others can't quite understand. A warm piece of bread becomes a small celebration. A heated room feels like luxury beyond measure. The sound of children laughing in safe playgrounds might bring tears to your eyes for reasons you can't easily explain to people who weren't there. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, surrounded by abundance that previous generations could barely imagine, remember that resilience lives quietly within ordinary people until extraordinary circumstances call it forth. Rest easy, knowing that the human spirit proves remarkably difficult to break even when tested by nearly 900 days of frozen hell. The survivors of Leningrad carried their stories forward as gifts to the future, reminders that civilization remains fragile, that ordinary people can endure incredible suffering, and that compassion somehow persists even in humanity's darkest hours. Their legacy whispers gently through history, a lullaby of survival that helps the rest of us sleep peacefully in a world they helped preserve. Sweet dreams, and remember you're stronger than you think, kinder than you know, and more resilient than you could ever imagine.